How to Win Friends and Influence People by Dale Carnegie. Basically, if you want to win more friends and have influence over people and have greater say, get greater sway even, this is really the book for you. Great book. Okay. Hi guys, this is Nick Knightsbridge with another book review for you. So let's get straight into it. First section, something as simple as smiling goes a long way. People don't realize kind of how much of an effect that has on people's first impressions on you. I mean, we all hear when we go to interviews and whatnot to smile, but there's a lot of psychology behind it. It triggers positive emotions. People are much more likely to, kind of open up to you from the get-go. And with research, we know that, according to the book, that it's not a one-way thing. So smiling is not just a reaction to being happy. It also can be the cause. So smiling more, according to Carnegie, who quotes psychologists, the more you smile, the more likely it is to exhibit positive feelings in you, and then, vice versa, back and forth. All right, so next section, don't criticize others. This is a big one and really, really hard to instill in oneself, I would say, me being top of the list. Criticizing, basically, Carnegie argues, doesn't really help anyone. The person becomes more entrenched in their own thinking, more defensive, and they feel attacked. So much less likely to kind of open up and listen to you, or try and envision what you're trying to say or your ideas. So the author argues that this is this is the case because people are not driven primarily by reason or logic, but rather by emotion. So if they don't, essentially, if you're doing something that causes them to react negatively, they're kind of going to be put off, turned off, distance themselves from you. So yeah, it's important to note. You might, obviously, everyone knows that it feels great. I mean, maybe I'm a sadist a little bit, but it feels great sometimes to criticize, because you let off steam. You can show the other person you're right. Well, rather, you can kind of think you're showing the other person that you're right. But yeah, it's a way to show your intelligence, be witty, but it kind of backfires on you. Because people are going to like you less, and again, they're going to be turned off by being attacked. Obviously, quote in the book mentions Benjamin Franklin and the fact that he was one to never criticize people openly. So he's once quoted to say, "Speak ill of no man," which is very telling. He obviously accomplished quite a lot, not least beyond the $100 bill. Abraham Lincoln also during obviously the Civil War said, when others were criticizing a lot of Southern slave owners from the Confederacy, obviously Lincoln was president, so he's a Yankee, so to speak. He would say that don't criticize them. They're just doing what we would do under the same circumstances. So, important feature of Lincoln, obviously, was known as a peacemaker in many ways. He brought people together by not criticizing and envisioning him in the other in his opponent's position, to see basically that it's not completely illogical for the other person to be following his train of thought or coming up with his ideas, etc. So, another important thing, forgiveness. But it's important because it shows character. And it shows, humility, and it shows humanity. You should always, as Lincoln did, put yourself in their place. Don't openly criticize them, and because really, in the long run, it doesn't serve any purpose. All right, so next section, show your appreciation. According to the author, it's really important for people, as most sociologists would agree, to feel to feel and be appreciated. But that has to be sincere. You can't just basically BS praise on them and expect them to buy it. Essentially, that's what that means. People are social beings, of course, and they need not constant, but they're always searching for approval. And the basis, basically, for a lot of things that we've accomplished in the course of human civilization has been on the basis, really, the author argues, of approval and delayed gratification. So many things, the internet, technology, etc. A lot of these things, he posits, that were started because people were looking to impress or awe, find approval, acceptance, and of course add to that what I think is some delayed gratification that's necessary. Otherwise, we wouldn't get anywhere. All right, so the potential for praise is a much bigger incentive than the fear of punishment for any kind of job. So just shows you kind of how people think, in that the fear of criticism is never as big, or in most people's case is not as big as the praise they should receive. So they take risks, they take chances. Don't forget simple pleasantries. Thank you, please, sorry. Don't take, make sure to be sincere, as I mentioned before. Shallowness is pretty transparent. Honesty is also vital. Modesty too. One famous figure by the name of Ralph Waldo Emerson said that every person he meets has or had a superiority in a certain way. So basically, you can appreciate everyone, even if they're really someone from a very different field, walk of life, etc. You can still find something in someone else that probably is done in a way that's more superior to yours. So everyone has their niche, everyone has their talents, or niche, should I say. Don't turn into a European on me, huh? All right, so show respect. It'll make it easier for people to praise you, value their work, and they will return in kind, obviously. All right, next section. Interesting people are interested in others. So, people are pretty much interested in themselves. So the author says, so to kind of endear yourself, you should be interested in them too. So listening is really important. Try to encourage people to do that and talk about themselves and don't cut them off, essentially. Freud was, obviously, Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, some would argue, was really good at this, and he kind of always encouraged people to talk about themselves and showed genuine interest. And these people returned in kind by opening up to him and sharing their deepest, darkest thoughts, and obviously part of the reason why Freud is so well known today. Something else important to remember is that people who talk about themselves at length and don't listen to others, and often interrupt quickly, become disliked and are labeled as self-centered. So no one wants that label. Essentially, if you do these things, then the fastest way to have people turn themselves off, distance themselves, close up, clam up, whatever you want to call it. All right. Talk about what's important for others. So basically, just segue from the last point was be knowledgeable about what people like, employees, colleagues, whatever, what their hobbies are, activities are. And it's always good to prep yourself. If you're meeting someone like significant, you should prep yourself if possible on what they like. Kind of like you'd go for an interview. Know what they're about. Know what they like. Positives, negatives, etc. Emphasis on the positives. And you should find something you admire about that person. Much like what I alluded to before, is that everyone has something that they can do better than others. Maybe you can compliment the person on that. Tell them about it. That goes a long way. And of course, the old adage treat others as you want to be treated, is also important to remember. All right, next thing, remember. People find it really important and endearing when you remember things about them. Obviously, names, dates, birthdays, spouses, etc. These all go a long way. They show that you care and that you were listening. And if that sounds a little crazy, Carnegie, the author, would suggests that you take a notebook with you maybe, and after every encounter, you sit down for a few minutes, take some notes down of important facts, so you can go over it again. Obviously, when you reread something again and again, you kind of move it from short-term memory to long-term memory. So that's important to remember. If you're one of those people that are really bad with names and things like that, that's a good idea for you. Another good idea is to use the person's name as much as possible when talking to them. So kind of, to just imprint that on your memory. That's a good trick to use. I've used that myself. It works because I'm pretty bad with names, unfortunately. Keep having to look back at Carnegie to remember his name. So, case in point. Teddy Roosevelt, President of the United States, not to be confused with another relative of his, FDR. Roosevelt, the first Roosevelt, was famous for using the names of all his staff. So he'd never address them by their occupation or their position, when they worked for him. Now, I don't know if this was just at the White House or everywhere else, but it's probably his whole professional career. He used their names, and obviously the staff felt closer, more important, and respected. So good trait to have. Next section. Avoid arguments. Now, this kind of obviously not so easy to do, but let me highlight the kind of things that the author talks about as the reasoning for avoiding arguments. First one is that really no one wins an argument. I'm sure you guys have had experiences with that. Basically, you shout, say a few things, the other person shouts back, and even if you have the logic and you have a higher position in terms of morality or whatnot, whatever the case may be, in the end, both parties kind of feel like they've lost out, right? So the other person becomes, again, just entrenched, doesn't want to listen. So really, you haven't helped anything. So basically, best to avoid them. The author suggests the way you should approach such a scenario, such a situation, is that you show appreciation for their point, and you kind of try and think about their reasoning. Put yourself essentially in their shoes, instead of using negativity, and that way you can kind of align yourselves more. You can kind of walk halfway across the bridge if you expect them also to do the same. And if an argument is unavoidable, Carnegie says that basically it's best done when the emotions aren't so raw. Some time has passed, maybe, if possible, and you've had a chance to collect your thoughts, so that you can make them without kind of judgment and being mean, so that the other person is more likely to at least listen properly, if not accept your posit or your point of view. This nicely segues us into the next section, which is not telling people that they're wrong. So obviously kind of best way to avoid arguments also. This is a good tip. Don't directly tell people that they're wrong. They're just going to feel hurt, essentially, and it's another way of saying they're inferior to you. So that's best avoided. And absolute terms are best avoided. So things like obviously, it's clear that, these kind of things have a certain superiority, kind of a tone of superiority added to them, kind of intrinsic to them, and it doesn't show any respect for your kind of opposers' opinions, and they feel judged maybe and put down. So again, more likely to clam up, and not really listen. Because essentially you're telling them that they are not as smart as you, and that's exactly what you don't want to be doing when you're trying to endear yourself to them or influence people. So you shouldn't approach kind of in these scenarios where you need to highlight something that they may be doing wrong, in your opinion. You should approach the kind of topic from an alternate way. It shouldn't be head on, and make sure you don't demean them, obviously, and that way you're much less likely to get pushback, resistance, and the person is more likely to consider your case, and they might even turn into an ally, someone on your team after such an encounter. Again, Benjamin Franklin was known to avoid terms like undoubtedly or certainly, because again it's very absolute and sounds kind of judgy, if I may use that term. Instead, he would use things like I imagine or I conceive. I'm not so sure you'll get away with the second one in the 21st century, but still, you guys get the point. All right, next section. If you're wrong, own up, fess up to it, and fast. So it's better to criticize yourself. We're talking about obviously in public or in front of others. It's better to do self-criticism than be kind of admonished and berated by other people, because you kind of take the wind out of their sails, your opponent. I mean, if you criticize yourself already, what are they going to do? Just bash you over the head with something? They can't. You kind of took the wind out of their sails. You stole their thunder, so to speak, and it also makes you more congenial, and it makes you more vulnerable, which is what people want to see if they're to trust you. So that's really important to note. One personal experience from the author was a scenario where he was walking a dog without a muzzle, and a police officer, and apparently this type of dog needed to be muzzled, I believe, or this place, and he was confronted by a police officer who was probably going to cite him, but the author owned up to it, apologized, said he was wrong, that it was an oversight, and basically got away with just a warning. Because what else could the police officer do? I mean, obviously he could have given the citation, but he was less likely to do so when he knows that the person was genuine and honest about making a mistake, doing something wrong. And author says that public self-criticism requires character, humility, and to make to make yourself weak, as I mentioned, if you open up, if you make yourself vulnerable, people are much more likely to trust you, which is exactly what you want if you want to be influencing them or getting closer to them. And last section is kind of going off of the Socratic Method, and I'll get into that in a second. It's basically getting people to say yes as often as possible. So, I'll talk about that again in a minute, but persuasion should be done indirectly. So you should be polite, you should be engaging, you should listen, and because again, if you're aggressive, there's going to be pushback, resistance. They're gonna kind of like a hermit crab back in their shell. And highlight. It's important to highlight to your opponent that you have common ground. Now, it really doesn't matter. We've kind of seen human psychology. We want to feel like we are part of a social group, a social fabric. So common ground is important, like shared interests, likes, hobbies. Even the star signs, place of birth, hometowns, etc. All of these things. So. Let them feel that basically you have a shared aim, a shared goal, even if this is not the end goal. So that's important to know. And use lots of questions. And the Socratic Method, as I mentioned, is basically getting people to say yes a lot. So if you don't agree with someone on a kind of an end point, use some minor points in between that you do agree on, and get them to say yes, essentially. So, agree to things. The more they say yes, the more likely they are to say yes at the end goal. When you reveal it, of course, that shouldn't be revealed till the very end. And if you use that, really your biggest opposers can turn into allies, and you can essentially get someone who was completely against your train of thought, your logic, to say yes and to agree. So I hope that helps you guys. Great book. If you're hoping to somehow manipulate people into being your friends, I hope it's not for ulterior motives, but great book if also for people who maybe have not the greatest social skills and they find making friends and being heard is difficult. It's not only for people that are trying to manipulate others, of course, but definitely recommend it. Dale Carnegie, How to Win Friends and Influence People. Okay, thanks. Bye.